and welcome to the first episode of Shaken Not Burned, a podcast about the big sustainability stories and solutions. My name's Felicia Jackson, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Giulia and Heather Dinwoody. We all used to work together and firmly believe that we can meet sustainability and climate challenges. We talk about the stories that we think tell us something about the way the world is changing, and talk to change makers actively working for a better future. So the way we plan on doing things is each of us is going to pick one of the big stories of the week. And as I said hello to everyone, I'm going to start. The story I want to talk about is the recent announcement of the Labour U-turn on 28 billion for, a green future. Now, I know it's a politics story, but I think it's incredibly important that those of us in the sustainability world actually recognise that if we don't get the politics right, we're not going to get the policy right. And actually, at the moment we're living in a world where we're being run by a party that constantly seems to have leadership elections or leadership challenges. It's overseen decimation of the health service. There's huge welfare problems. There are people who are working full-time jobs and still having to go to food banks. There's something clearly wrong in the way that we're doing things. Now, anyone interested in sustainability knows there's lots of different ways you can approach how you build a better world. But in a sense, one of the first steps has got to be recognizing the importance of changing the way we do things. And that doesn't mean anything specific, because it means everything. We need to do politics differently. Companies need to address operational changes that they need to make. And I think we're in this period where no one seems to be prepared to say out loud, there are some serious problems coming. Extreme weather, supply chain breakdowns, they're going to have an impact, and they're going to have an impact all over the world. It's going to be hard and it's going to cost money, but it has to be done. And actually what we really need, at least I think what we really need in politics, is someone who's prepared to say it and the ability to communicate why it's cheaper to do things now than later. As the longer we wait, the harder it's going to be, the more it's going to cost, and the more people aren't going to want to deal with it. And I get that no politician wants to talk about something negative. They don't want to be seen as having an unelectable issue. But at the very least, I thought with Labour, we were getting a commitment to building a different future, that we were actually going to have investment in new technologies and new ways of doing things. And I know that the market has changed and the number was 28 billion. Part of me questions why the opposition had to come up with a sort of number and a specific plan.
Well, I actually think, as much as, yes, it is important that we talk about the hardships, it's important that we talk about the needs of what we're doing. But what I think fundamentally this turning point from Labour points to is the need for trusted politicians that people will vote for. That is the main thing here. Like, we know that we've got a general election coming this year. I'm sort of presuming November-ish. What we need is a party that can actually ride the momentum that Labour has had in the polls. Because at this stage, I don't want to take anything for granted. And I don't think anyone does. And I really think that this story is about the fact that people in the streets are going to look at Keir Starmer and think, another U-turn. And that just creates that sense of distrust that ends up with Labour not winning, as everyone has at one point expected them to. And that's the real difficulty here. It's not necessarily the 28 billion, although yes, it's disappointing to hear that won't come, but it's more about the direction, and that direction is in jeopardy when we make these unrealistic commitments and then years down the line decide that we can't deliver on them.
I think it's fascinating you talk about trust, because I think that seems to be the thing that's missing the most, both in politics, but also between consumers and corporations. We don't trust people to do things the right way. Sorry, Giulia, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, sorry, my connection went and I missed something, but I hope I'm not repeating what you said. My concern here is, what is Labour trying to achieve? What kind of voters are they trying to attract? Because it feels like they want to attract the people that are concerned with the cost of living crisis. But really, we need some politicians that tell people, look, we need to spend this money because the return of investment will be much greater than not taking action and then finding ourselves with huge costs down the line for various reasons, for various things. But we need bold climate action and explain to people, if we invest this money, we are not taking it away from other worthy causes like the NHS or schools or, other types of infrastructure. And so I'm just worried that they're basically playing the same game that the Tories were playing when it comes to green policies.
I think it's a really, really good point, because the one thing we don't seem to have anywhere is inspiration. We don't have that trust that you talked about, Heather, and people need hope. There's a lot of negative stories and, climate anxiety, but the cost of living crisis, so many people are facing so many challenges that it would be really nice to see someone bold enough to make a move and say, this is the direction we're going because we have to. And actually include everyone. We're supposed to live in a democracy, and we're currently the country's being run by an unelected prime minister in a party that, let's be honest, is beginning to represent a very backward-looking view of the world, where change is scary just because it's change. And there are a lot of people very upset because they're losing the privilege and the power that they've always had, and they're pushing back against it. But that's my sort of political rant of the week.
Yeah, but it's convenient to pretend this is not existing. One might argue there are more pressing challenges now than climate change because, so as you said earlier, some people have full-time jobs and they need to still go to food banks, and there are massive problems with NHS and with schools. But climate change is also a problem. I think it's just easier to pretend it doesn't exist and sweep it under the carpet.
Well, I think what people forget is it's a risk multiplier. We've got all these problems that exist and that need to be addressed, but climate change is going to result in a much more unstable economy and a much more unstable way of living. And that's going to affect everything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually think I disagree with you a little about just the nature of this story, really, because I don't think Labour has turned around and said climate change isn't important. I'm not saying I take verbatim their reasoning that the economy is in a worse state than when they first made this pledge. I dare say there are many reasons behind their U-turn, but I think this wasn't where they wanted to go. I don't think they've actively made a decision that says we don't care about this.
No, do you know what I think's happened? They fell into a traditional Tory trap.
Yeah. Labour
made a promise about numbers, and the Tory party went, well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to meet that amount of money? Where's it going to come from? Are you going to raise taxes? They're the opposition. Have a vision. Lead people forward. That would be an amazing thing.
It's not for me to sing Labour's praises, and I will definitely say that if there's one thing Keir Starmer lacks, it may be that inspiration and hope you're talking about, because even in some of his most proper and clever discussions, I've never once looked at him and thought, oh yeah, lead me, Keir.
I don't think I can top that as part of this story. So on that note, we'll move on to Giulia. Giulia, what's your story this week?
Yes, hello. I think my story might also be somewhat of a policy rant. Okay, it's positive because, just to rewind, Norway in January approved deep sea mining in the Arctic, which is very concerning because considering that we don't know what's going on in the vast majority of our oceans, doing some activities that are as disruptive as deep sea mining might create consequences that we are not predicting, and scientists are saying the damage done by deep sea mining could be too big to offset with other measures. So it's risky, very, very, very risky. And we kind of don't need it because, yes, there is demand for critical minerals and there is, regular land mining. But also we could enhance recycling technologies, for example, from e-waste, and, we all have phones sitting in a drawer. And, if we were able to recycle all of these or, use batteries, we could just not go mining the sea, for example. So anyway, Norway, a country generally praised for its green policies, approved this despite the environmental agency said that the environmental assessments were not satisfactory enough to prove that this was not going to be damaging. So the European Parliament voted in favor of a resolution that is supporting a moratorium of deep sea mining, which is something that is being discussed in the international community. Now, we need to remember here that Norway is not part of the European Union, but is part of the EEA. So they do have some treaties and agreements in place. So this means that because the EU is basically a neighbor in this area, which some of which is in international waters, it means that Norway can't just do whatever it wants. And also, if the European Union backs a global moratorium of deep sea mining alongside other jurisdictions, then no country, it's possible that in the future, no country will be able to approve it even in its own waters. So this is, I would say, a step in the right direction. I think many people here are concerned about the consequences of deep sea mining. I think to me kind of speaks of the hypocrisy of Norway, because it's all about its green policies and how well they're doing when it comes to the environment. And then they suggest this, which is potentially worse than even oil and gas extraction. So, yeah, I think it's a good and a bad story at the same time.
It's what's really interesting to me is it's really indicative of the power of the collective. And I don't mean that in a socialist sense. I mean that when people collaborate and work together, you can actually stop people doing the worst, most destructive things. But it is a real challenge because there are countries out there, understandably reliant on income from fossil fuel sales. And there are countries worried about access to materials and they're trying to find new ways of doing it. I just think it kind of feels like if everybody is running around trying desperately to shore up their own position, they're totally missing the interconnectedness of how things work. They're totally missing that there are ways of changing practices. You mentioned it, Giulia, with sort of getting metals out of e-waste. If we actually did manage to recycle what was going on, what we have, we would have a huge supply. I think it's approximately 1% of waste in the UK is actively recycled because so much of the time, things are contaminated with food waste or they're put in the wrong bins or glass is mixed in with some, so it's quite hard to do. And it's getting better. There's some really interesting companies using AI to improve the processes, but perhaps that's where we should be spending the money rather than digging out the seabed, creating a path of destruction and ignoring half the other problems we face. What we want is for people to do things where it doesn't just solve one problem, but it solves multiple problems at the same time. That's why the SDGs were kind of set up, not just because they're goals for how countries should try and get their people to live with, good jobs and clean air and health and education. But all of these things are interconnected. You just have to look at some of the impacts of, getting incomes to women African farmers, because the impact that has on families and the land and the children's education and healthcare. These things all come into play together.
I think it's really interesting that you've both touched on alternatives here, because that's something that I hear as criticism of environmentalists and whatnot quite a lot, is people say, oh yeah, it's all very well to complain about this, that, or the next thing, but they don't have the solutions. But Fee, you've mentioned sort of the interconnectedness with other goals that we have. And Giulia, you've talked more directly about recycling. And I just... I think it's great that us as, let's be honest, we're not operationally involved in this space. And you can see these things. You might not have the details pinned down, but you can see these options that we have open to us. And speaking on, recycling and things, I know the Global Circularity Gap report came out fairly recently, and that showed another year-on-year decline in circularity. And there's a lot of complexities in the way that we measure circularity. It's also worth noting that, as we consume more materials every year, the number goes down partly due to that. But it's falling year on year, and yet innovation continues year on year. There are so many things we can do. I write about so many recycling technologies, things coming out. And the whole deep sea mining thing, a part of me was going to say, oh, it just screams of desperation, desperation for security, desperation for jobs, and this, that, and the next thing. But then I'm like, what? It's not desperation. In many ways, it's just blind greed, being blind to the other options that are there.
Yeah, I think it really speaks of two things. I think it's the sheer lack of respect for ecosystems that we have, the fact that we don't, unless they're valued monetarily, they're not valued. And also the huge disconnect that we need, like, people are looking at deep sea mining to power the green transition. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. There's no green transition if all the ecosystems are destroyed.
Well, Giulia, I love that story because it does talk about so many of the different things that we go on about all the time. One of the most important ones being, as Heather raised, there are solutions. People just don't seem to be using them enough. On that front, I think, Heather, it's time for your story. What are you talking to us about this week?
Yeah, so I think I'm definitely warming to the theme of the episode here, but I wanted to talk about a report that came out last week by the Environmental Investigation Agency. And it basically looked at 10 palm oil companies, which are, they've been linked to some major household brands. We're talking your Colgates, Nestle, Kellogg's, and the like. And basically, this report was sort of looking into the impact of a law that was rushed through in Peru in January. And this law was brought in, and what it basically does is it legalizes a lot of historic deforestation that would previously have been seen as unlawful, and potentially carries those impacts onto future deforestation as well. It's all about land ownership. It's all complicated. I'm not going to go into all the conditions, but it's a large amount of deforestation that would once have been considered unlawful is now being considered lawful. Now, the problem is that this law itself has been found in breach of international treaties, and it has basically been rushed in to preserve trade in the face of the EU's deforestation regulation coming in. And I just think this story really speaks to sort of the difficulty of everything that we're trying to do, because, we've got this big piece of legislation coming in the EU, and it's supposed to be groundbreaking leadership on protecting forests, protecting ecosystems. Some of the major brands in question, they've all got their policies in place. They've all got science-based targets in place. I took the liberty of seeing how they'd done in their recent CDP submissions. And, some of them have got A-, Bs for their disclosure about deforestation. And you just think, okay, after all this, those big companies whose products line our shelves are still being linked to deforestation that, okay, it might technically be legal now, but is it legal if the law that legalized it is in breach of a treaty? And I don't know. It all just made me very sad and very frustrated, so I thought I would air it here and hope that you two would make me feel better.
I don't know if I can make you feel better about it, except for one thing, which is it's so patently a way of getting round a treaty problem. The focus is on a trade issue. It is going to make it difficult for companies which are trying to create deforestation-free products if they're buying from someone who can legally say, this is deforestation free. It's a horrible, horrible, complicated thing. But actually, although it's a bit too little too late, this kind of panicked response shows that that kind of legislation does have an impact. It does work. And I think there is a lot of frustration amongst everybody who operates in this space that we're not doing more, that we're not doing it faster, that we're not making the changes we need to. But we have to be conscious of the fact that change happens in lots of different ways. Things that are normal for one generation are completely insane for another. Just look at the lifestyles and the expectations of ever increasing growth. You're supposed to get a good education and get a good job, and then you get a good house, and then you try and move to a bigger house. And there's this whole pathway that seems to be set out. And you talk to young people today, and they are genuinely more concerned about the value of what they do than the price of what they get. Do you see what I mean? I know it's slow.
I'm not a legal expert by any mean, but it looks like Peru is being called out here. And, it doesn't look like they're getting away with it, I hope. So I know that, again, it's not a nice story to read. Like, it's very discouraging. But then at the same time, people are concerned. And, we were speaking earlier about the power of the collective and, global action and holistic view of policies. So I don't know. My hope is that maybe Peru will change.
I suppose, I think tied into that is my hope that EU regulators are really going to think about the traceability requirements, the reporting requirements that they're...
Traceability is so important.
Oh, I know. And, again, this is one where I could harp on about how there are solutions, because for those who don't know, I used to write a lot of our collective coverage on technologies and things, and there's some incredible traceability technologies, like invisible markers that you can put into materials and it'll survive throughout the value chain. You can trace it the whole way. There's blockchain solutions. There's all of this kind of thing. But I just think we really need to nail down what is important and stop faffing around with words and with targets and disclosure, which are important. They are. But first of all, we need to be able to look at the problem, to track the problem, to monitor it, to analyse it, and then we can get on to saying how great we all are at solving it.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and think that a company would rather, look like they're doing the right thing from the get-go instead of admitting their mistakes. Not naming any specific company, thank you. No, don't take me.
But you know what? We have to get better at admitting our mistakes. That's the whole thing. If
Everyone makes mistakes.
There's all this talk about people being worried about greenwash, and then they're worried about green hush because they don't want anyone to have a go at them. And actually, it's time everyone lifted their skirts and showed their ankles.
Ooh,
we need to know what's going on. Sorry, I'm so old. My analogies are just getting ridiculous.
For the listeners, Felicia is not from the 1800s.
But you know what I mean? You need to be able to see.
Yeah.
You need to be able to see what's going on, not smoke and mirrors.
I have lots of respect for companies that do admit their problems, because if you've been around for decades or centuries, some companies, especially in the consumer goods sector, it's fine if you're not doing things the right way. Really, there's no one size fits all here. Everyone is trying and hoping for the best. So if you show that you're actually trying, is more commendable than pretend like you're doing really well, while actually it's just words on a spreadsheet.
Well, I think you can all tell we all do agree with each other. Now, that's all for our chat about the big sustainability stories for a week. Luckily enough, today we have a guest who's going to be talking us through one approach to solutions to the problems we face. We're lucky enough to be joined today by Bronwen Smith-Thomas, who's the head of campaigns and politics at the Climate Coalition. Welcome, Bronwen. I hope, first of all, you could tell us a little bit about what exactly the Climate Coalition is.
Sure. So really nice to be here. The Climate Coalition is a really diverse network of organisations. So together, our supporters are sort of all over the country. Our organisations range from really large household names like WWF or Oxfam or Save the Children, down to really small local organisations who are working in communities. And the thing that they really have in common, they're not all climate change experts, but everything that they do is under threat from climate change. The things that they work for, the things that their members and supporters love and want to protect, whether that be wildlife or the places they work in or the people they work with, they're all going to be affected by climate change in some way. And so we start from the premise that people have power, and especially when we come together, we are powerful. So our role is about bringing organisations together to sort of channel that into collective action and create the space that we need for the political change that will help us all create the future that we want.
I mean, this sounds to me like an incredibly powerful idea because one of the things we try and talk a lot about is solutions, because of the fact that I think so many people feel so overwhelmed by how big the challenge is and how negative so much of the mainstream media's conversation is. This sort of seems to me to be an attempt to not only empower people sort of through collective action, but a recognition that politics, I mean, it's one of the phrases I often hear in the sustainability world is to get the policies right, you've got to get the politics right. Mm-hmm. You know, and is that something that the Climate Coalition sort of works on and encourages?
Yes, and I think if we take politics in a really broad sense, like politics in the sense of how people can be political citizens. So we're not, a party political organisation, and we're really pushing all political parties to take action. And the way we see is kind of really important of doing that is that people, if they raise their voices together, can be powerful. And one of the things we're seeing happening is that people all over the country and all over the world, but we work in the UK specifically, is people are taking action already. They are doing things to have a positive impact in their communities, whether that be setting up kind of community fridges to reduce food waste, or creating programs where people can get energy efficiency advice to reduce their energy bills and reduce their carbon emissions. Where these things are not being done by government or by councils, people are stepping in. And what they need, I think, is two things. One is to recognise, and this is where the sort of thing we're trying to do, is that other people are doing that as well. They're not alone. There is actually a movement, but it's not very visible, of community climate action. And the second thing is that they need politicians to sort of step in behind them and alongside them and make all that easier. Because making those sustainable choices is quite hard for a lot of people, whether they don't have the information or they find it too expensive or they don't have the infrastructure to be able to make the right choices. And those things really do need politicians to support that change that actually people across the UK really do want.
Well, I think it's quite an interesting thing because obviously we all know there's quite a lot of people who do want to make a difference and want to make change. Mm-hmm. But it's one of the things we talk about sometimes is choice architecture and the fact that you only have the options of the choices available to you. And that to a certain extent, the system we work within is what defines the choices that are available, dependent on where you are and who you are and the access you have. And actually that in itself is a challenge and a problem. Yeah. And that actually, I think the thing that's really interesting, and one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you, is because obviously in the UK this is an election year. And there is a sense amongst many, you look at the rise of climate anxiety in young people, and there's a real sense that they don't have the power to affect change. Whereas this idea of sort of coming together and supporting each other and taking politics seriously and just saying, support us in our choices, is a chance to actually take action and make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And we think one of the things we know from polling and from research with MPs is that there is actually a big gap between what MPs think that their constituents think and what people actually think about climate. So MPs tend to downgrade how important the ordinary public thinks that climate action is. And that's one of the things we want to change. We want people to be talking to their political candidates in this election year and saying, to all of those candidates, whoever gets in, we want you to be the government that makes the change we need in the next, 5 years that takes us almost to 2030. By 2030, we need a government that is taking a global lead, that is actually delivering on its climate commitments, and creating a more sustainable world. So this next Parliament is absolutely critical. And if they don't hear from the public that they want change on climate, they won't feel that sort of sense of being held accountable. And we know that that's really important for politicians to actually make change. And one of the things we're launching is this new tool called the Local Intelligence Hub, which is designed to help people have those conversations with their political candidates at a local level. So it gives people a huge array of data, localised by constituency, so you can find out, opinion polling data. What do people in your constituency think about climate change, about net zero, about nature? What do they want the government to do? And also you can find out statistics about your local area. So, how many households are in fuel poverty? What's the what's your MP and what's their position on different issues, and what all-party parliamentary groups are they in? That sort of information that empowers you then to go and have a conversation backed up with data and say, this is what things are like in my area and this is why you need to be taking further action.
And I think an aspect of this that I think is also very interesting is the challenge, I think, that a lot of politicians may feel that it's a difficult conversation to have, that addressing sustainability and climate challenges is going to be expensive and it's going to be difficult in some ways. And they don't seem to want to have that conversations. Do you think this is a way of helping them feel empowered to have those conversations?
You mean the politicians as well? Yeah, I think it could be. I mean, this is it's a publicly accessible tool that we've created. It pulls together data from all sorts of places. So a lot of it isn't new, but what's new is putting it together so that you can see all this data sort of cross-referenced in your area. And absolutely, for a politician as well, to be able to see that and understand what their constituents are thinking, and be able to realise, I think, two things. One is that there is very, very high concern, as you say, anxiety in some cases for the state of the climate, the state of nature as well, that we are facing a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis. And at the same time, people are obviously concerned about, the front of mind issues about things like energy bills or waiting lists in the NHS. And obviously, those front of mind things will come first if those are the challenges you're facing in your everyday life. But what we know is that the solutions to these things go together. If done well, done with the right policies that support people in the change that they need to make, those changes, so for example, making your house more energy efficient, it's the best way to drive down your energy bills because you're using less energy. Now, people need support with any investment that's required up front, but that investment is investment. It will pay back. It's also, if there was a decent programme of investment in energy efficiency and retrofit, that would be supporting a huge array of small businesses all across the country who would be doing that work. Now, that feels to me like an absolute win-win-win situation. And that's the sort of thing where you need government support, because without it, it could be too expensive for people to do on their own. But with the right support, the right policy incentives, it will pay back, and it will pay back quite quickly. So it doesn't have to be about, are these policies too expensive to do? It's the right policies.
The right policies in the right place, in the right way, at the right time. And supporting the right people. Not everyone's in the same position. So, you need to be able to, I think, as you said earlier, kind of create the space in which you can make the right choices. And that is really where we need government to support us. And I mean, an aspect of that that's very interesting to me is obviously one of the reasons that people only have the choices in front of them is partly policy, but it's also business decisions. And those are often driven by policy. I know that this is not part of what the Local Intelligence Hub is about, but do you have any thoughts on how business can most effectively engage with policymakers about framing policy and investment models in the way that you're describing?
Yeah, so we work primarily with the public and engaging the public with their politicians. I think the key thing really with business is we know there are businesses who want regulation and certainty. I think that's incredibly important for business, not to see either an uncertainty about what's coming or a change in government, that sort of switching from one target to another, that is really unhelpful for any business in any sector. And I think, with secure long-term targets and regulation and good policy in place, I think businesses are ready to make the positive changes in many cases. And I think, again, I'll come back to government. Where they're not, where there are sectors that are highly polluting or really struggling to make that transition, we actually do need regulation that will support that transition and support the people who work in those sectors that are, going to need to shift. So there's a lot that is connected, I think, here. I really think we need, as I say, that sort of long-term certainty from government, combined with the ambition, the right ambition, and the willingness to talk to all those different sectors, so the businesses, the individuals, the communities, so that we're getting it right for everyone, because it's complicated, right? It's not impossible. A lot of people are putting a lot of brain power into how do we get this right. And we need the right people to be listening and taking the whole thing. It feels it needs to be higher up the political agenda than it is at the moment.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because, some of the conversations I have with scientists, with technologists, with investors, we have the solutions we need to deal with the challenges we have. It's a question of, I suppose, socioeconomic fear and political unwillingness to say difficult things. So I suppose politicians have to be supported as well in order to create these transparent, long-term certainty and associated regulations that you're talking about.
And again, that is, I think, where people come in. We know there is this, very sort of strong and long-term concern for the environment that has been there, in opinion polls and in evidence from the fact that people are actually taking the action themselves. That if those people are talking more to politicians about that concern, about the need for change, politicians will be backed up in doing that more than perhaps they feel they are at the moment. And I think we have seen that shift over the last 5 years, say. Done some research recently with the University of Lancaster and with Green Alliance that did some really great qualitative research interviewing MPs about their attitudes to climate change, which was a repeat of some research done in 2019. And what was found was that the kind of concepts of climate and net zero had shifted from being a bit of an outlier in the political space 5 years ago, where MPs really felt if they spoke out, they might be seen as some sort of environmental sort of zealot. Shifted from that to it's very mainstream. You kind of can't say anything against taking action, but to some extent that's a sort of shallow commitment. And what we need now is for that to become a deeper commitment and to really be kind of shifting in all the different policy areas that we need. So we are seeing progress. And I think partly that is because people are demanding that progress.
Well, I think it's also fascinating with the growth of interest in the importance of nature, recognition that while we might make lots of arguments in the political sphere about the economy, an economy doesn't exist outside nature. We're dependent on it for existence. So it's really hard to understand why that's not part of everyday conversation.
Yeah, and political conversation as well. So I think we'd probably find it was more part of everyday conversation in the sense that I think nature is something that people feel close to in their own communities, in their own environments, that whether that's a sort of a garden or a balcony or a local park, or if you're lucky enough to live in sort of some amazing wild bit of the countryside, you feel that connection and we know that's something that's important when we run campaigns that ask people to share the things they love that they want to protect from climate change. Nature comes up again and again. That really does boost people's well-being, and people feel that great protection of that space around them. And I think it does need to be taken a lot more seriously in the political discourse as well, because, as you say, it's not just nice scenery. It's absolutely fundamental to our lives, and without it, we can't function, our economy can't function. So, yeah, I think that is, for us, very, we talk about climate and nature a lot because they are so intrinsically linked. You can't solve the climate crisis without, solving the biodiversity crisis and vice versa. So, absolutely, both need solving together.
I mean, what I really do love about what you're doing is that by bringing all this information together, you're giving people tools to make their own decisions about what they do. You're helping people identify what they can do as individuals and the pressure that they can put on the political system to do things differently, which I've got to say I find really exciting and really positive, because it's really nice to have a story about something where you can actually do something and we can actually sort of, take back some power and add our own voices to the discussion. And I think it's an incredibly powerful thing to do. So is there anything I haven't asked you about the Climate Coalition that you wish I had?
So I think I've talked about the Local Intelligence Hub. I think one of the things that we have done just this week to show its power really is we've done a bit of analysis that pulls out the marginal constituencies where we see the highest concern for climate and nature, and where we think this analysis shows that in those places, green policies could really be vote winners. And I think that's the message we're really trying to get across to politicians at the moment. It is an election year, and I think done in the right way, people are ready for really strong policies on climate and nature that they can vote for, and that they can vote for something positive that will actually make a positive change, not just in the climate and environmental sphere, but as we've talked about, done right, this supports our well-being, it supports our economy, it supports our health, and that is a positive message that I think people are ready to hear from politicians.
I absolutely love it. On that note, I will say thank you so much for joining us, Bronwen. It's really exciting to hear about what you're doing. For those of you who joined us today, thank you for listening. Follow us wherever you follow your podcasts, and we'll be back soon.